tonight we continue some storytelling, but first, thank you everyone who has been a supporter of this channel for the last several months. The channel, I think, this month is going to hit 6 months old, and in 6 months, I believe right now we're at like roughly 384 subscribers, which is really quite a lot, and I greatly appreciate everyone who has swung by. I know many of you are from the ASMR nerd streams and videos. I appreciate you very much. To everyone else who maybe just happened to stumble across my video, because I know some of you are out there, thank you for subscribing as well. I appreciate you. If you would, on this video, if you like the content, leave a like, leave a comment, share it with some friends that you know are into ASMR also, or just share it among the ASMR community. I would really appreciate it. I'd love to have even more people that I can share these stories with and converse with in the comments below. So I do my best to message more or less each and every single person who comments. If I miss you here or there, forgive me, but again, I just wanted to express my gratitude before we jump into the story here. But today, we are jumping into another chapter of Tales of Norse Mythology by Helen A. Gerber. And last week was a relatively short video, and I know a lot of you really like the Norse mythology stuff, and I really like it too, so I figured I'd do a double whammy 2 weeks in a row where we do some Norse mythology. And I'm interested in this one because there is it's a goddess that I know absolutely nothing about, which has been the case for a couple of weeks now, really. It's been characters I know nothing of. And this one's name is, I believe it's pronounced Idun, although there's a part of me that thinks it could be Eden, which is a lot like Eden from the Garden of Eden. And I don't think, and honestly, I'm not really sure what YouTube's terms of service are in terms of portraits of, like classic portraits here, but this is a photo of Eden on the left by V.E. Ward. Basically, she's just kind of laying down by a pool of water, and if I have to take a guess, which I have not read this yet, I would guess that she's probably the goddess of spring or something like that. So, getting all the trees and flowers and stuff like that. So here we go. Chapter 7. Idun. The Apples of Youth. Idun, I'm already right. The personification of spring or immortal youth, who according to some mythologists had no birth and was never to taste death, was warmly welcomed by the gods when she made her appearance in Asgard with Bragi. To further win their affections, she promised them a daily taste of the marvelous apples which she bore in her casket, and which had the power of conferring immortal youth and loveliness upon all who partook of them. The golden apples out of her garden have yielded you a dower of youth. Ate you them every day. Wagner. Thanks to this magic fruit, the Scandinavian gods, who, because they sprang from a mixed race, were not all immortal, warded off the approach of old age and disease, and remained vigorous, beautiful, and young through countless ages. These apples were therefore considered very precious indeed, and Eden, or Idun, carefully treasured them in her magic casket. No matter how many she drew out, the same number always remained for distribution at the feast of the gods, to whom alone she vouchsafed a taste. Although dwarfs and giants were eager to obtain possession of the fruit, bright Iduna, made immortal, standing at Valhalla's portal. In our casket has rich store of rare apples, gilded or those rare apples, not of earth, aging Aesir give fresh birth. The story of Thiassi. One day, Odin, Honir, and Loki started out upon one of their usual excursions to Earth, and after wandering for a long while, they found themselves in a deserted region where they could discover no hospitable dwelling. Weary and very hungry, the gods, perceiving a herd of oxen, slew one of the beasts, and kindling a fire, they sat down beside it to rest while waiting for their meat to cook. To their surprise, however, in spite of the roaring flames, the carcass remained quite raw. Realizing that some magic must be at work, they looked about them to discover what could hinder their cookery, when they perceived an eagle perched upon a tree above them. Seeing that he was an object of suspicion to the wayfarers, the bird addressed them and admitted that he it was who had prevented the fire from doing its accustomed work. But he offered to remove the spell if they would give him as much food as he could eat. The gods agreed to do this, whereupon the eagle, swooping downward, fanned the flames with his huge wings, and soon the meat was cooked. The eagle then made ready to carry off 3/4 of the ox as his share, but this was too much for Loki, who seized a great stake lying near at hand, and began to belabor the voracious bird, forgetting that it was skilled in magic arts. To his great dismay, one end of the stake stuck fast to the eagle's back, and the other to his hands, and he found himself dragged over stones and through briars, sometimes through the air, his arms almost torn out of their sockets. In vain he cried for mercy and implored the eagle to let him go. The birds flew on until he promised any ransom his captor might ask in exchange for his release. The seeming eagle, who was the storm giant Thiassi, at last agreed to release Loki upon one condition. He made him promise upon the most solemn of oaths that he would lure Idun out of Asgard so that Thiassi might obtain possession of her and of her magic fruit. Released at last, Loki returned to Odin and Honir, to whom, however, he was very careful not to confide the condition upon which he had obtained his freedom. And when they had returned to Asgard, he began to plan how he might entice Idun outside of the god's abode. A few days later, Bragi being absent on one of his minstrel journeys, Loki sought Idun in the grove of Brunnaker, where she had taken up her abode, and by artfully describing some apples which grew at a short distance, and which he mendaciously declared were exactly like hers, he lured her away from Asgard with a crystal dish full of fruit, which she intended to compare with that which he extolled. No sooner had Idun left Asgard, however, than the deceiver Loki forsook her, and ere she could return to the shelter of the heavenly abode, the storm giant Thiassi swept down from the north on his eagle wings, and catching her up in his cruel talons, he bore her swiftly away to his barren and desolate home of Thrymheim. Thrymheim the Sixth is named where Thiassi dwelt, that all-powerful Jotun. Isolated from her beloved companions, Idun pined, grew pale and sad, but persistently refused to give Thiassi the smallest bite of her magic fruit, which, as he well knew, would make him beautiful and renew his strength and youth. All woes that fall on Odin's hall can be traced to Loki base. From out Valhalla's portal, 'twas he who pure Iduna lured, whose casket bare held apples rare that render gods immortal, and in Thiassi tower immured. Time passed, The gods, thinking that Idun had accompanied her husband and would soon return, at first paid no heed to her departure, but little by little the beneficent effect of the last feast of apples passed away. They began to feel the approach of old age and saw their youth and beauty disappear. So, becoming alarmed, they began to search for the missing goddess. Close investigation revealed the fact that she had been last seen in Loki's company, and when Odin sternly called him to account, he was forced to admit that he had betrayed her into the storm giant's power. By his mocking, scornful mien, soon in Valhall it was seen 'twas the traitor Loki's art which had led Idun apart to gloomy tower and Jotun power. The return of Idun. The attitude of the gods now became very menacing, and it was clear to Loki that if he did not devise means to restore the goddess, and that soon his life would be in considerable danger, he assured the indignant gods, therefore, that he would leave no stone unturned in his efforts to secure the release of Idun. And borrowing Freya's falcon plumage, he flew off to Thrymheim, where he found Idun alone, sadly mourning her exile from Asgard and her beloved Bragi. Changing the fair goddess into a nut, according to some accounts, or according to others, into a swallow, Loki grasped her tightly between his claws and then rapidly retraced his way to Asgard, hoping that he would reach the shelter of its high walls ere the Aesir returned from a fishing excursion in the northern seas to which he had gone. Meantime, the gods had assembled on the ramparts of the heavenly city, and they were watching for the return of Loki with far more anxiety than they had felt for Odin when he went in search of Odhrovir. Remembering the success of their ruse on that occasion, they had gathered great piles of fuel, which they were ready to set on fire at any moment. Suddenly, they saw Loki coming, but descried in his wake a great eagle. This was the giant Thiassi, who had suddenly returned to Thrymheim and found that his captive had been carried off by a falcon, in whom he readily recognized one of the gods. Hastily donning his eagle plumes, he had given immediate chase and was rapidly overtaking his prey. Loki redoubled his efforts as he neared the walls of Asgard, and ere Thiassi overtook him, he reached the goal and sank exhausted in the midst of the gods. Not a moment was lost in setting fire to the accumulated fuel, and as the pursuing Thiassi passed over the walls in his turn, the flames and smoke brought him to the ground crippled and half-stunned, an easy prey to the gods, who fell ruthlessly upon him and slew him. The Aesir were overjoyed at the recovery of Idun, and they hastened to partake of the precious apples which she had brought safely back. Feeling the return of their wonted strength and good looks with every mouthful they ate, they good-naturedly declared that it was no wonder if even the giants longed to taste the apples of perpetual youth. They vowed, therefore, that they would place the Aesir's eyes as a constellation in the heavens in order to soften any feeling of anger which his kinsmen might experience upon learning that he had been slain. Up I cast the eyes of all Valdi's son into the heavens serene. They are signs the greatest of my deeds. The physical explanation of this myth is obvious. Idun, the emblem of vegetation, is forcibly carried away in autumn when Bragi is absent and the singing of the birds has ceased. The cold wintry wind, Thiassi, detains her in the frozen, barren north where she cannot thrive until Loki, the south wind, brings back the seed or the swallow, which are both precursors of the returning spring. The youth, beauty, and strength conferred by Idun are symbolical of nature's resurrection in spring after winter's sleep, when color and vigor return to the earth, which had grown wrinkled and gray. As the disappearance of Idun vegetation was a yearly occurrence, we might expect to find other myths dealing with the striking phenomenon, and there is another favorite of the old skalds, which unfortunately has come down to us only in a fragmentary and very incomplete form. According to this account, Idun was once sitting upon the branches of the sacred ash Yggdrasil. When growing suddenly faint, she loosed her hold and dropped to the ground beneath, and down to the lowest depths of Niflheim. There she lay pale and motionless, gazing with fixed and horror-struck eyes upon the gruesome sights of Hell's realm, trembling violently the while, like one overcome by penetrating cold. In the dales dwells the prescient Dis, from Yggdrasil's ash sunk down, of Alfan race, Idun by name, the youngest of Ivaldi's elder children. She ill-brooked her descent under the hoar tree's trunk confined. She would not happy be with Norvi's daughter, accustomed to a pleasanter abode at home. Seeing that she did not return, Odin bade Bragi, Heimdall, and another of the gods go in search of her, giving them a white wolf skin to envelop her in, so that she should not suffer from the cold, and bidding them make every effort to rouse her from the stupor which her prescience told him had taken possession of her. A wolf's skin they gave her, in which herself she clad. Idun passively allowed the gods to wrap her in the warm wolf skin, but she persistently refused to speak or move, and from her strange manner her husband sadly suspected that she had had a vision of great ills. The tears ran continuously down her pallid cheeks, and Bragi, overcome by her unhappiness, at length bade the other gods return to Asgard without him, vowing that he would remain beside her as wife until she was ready to leave Hell's dismal realm. The sight of her woe oppressed him so sorely that he had no heart for his usual merry songs, and the strings of his harps were mute while he remained in the underworld. That voice like zephyr, or flower meads creeping, like Bragi's music his harp strings sweeping. In this myth, Idun's fall from Yggdrasil is symbolical of the autumnal falling of the leaves, which lie limp and helpless on the cold, bare ground until they are hidden from sight under the snow, represented by the wolf skin, which Odin, the sky, sends down to keep them warm, and the cessation of the birds' songs is further typified by Bragi's silent harp. And I will read some of Chapter 8 as well, and depending on its length, maybe even finish it. Chapter 8, Njord, who I know, again, nothing about. A hostage with the gods. We have already seen how the Aesir and Vanas exchanged hostages after the terrible war they had waged against each other, and that while Honir, Odin's brother, went to live in Vanaheim, Njord, with his two children Frey and Freya, definitely took up his abode in Asgard. In Vanaheim, wise powers him created, and to the gods a hostage gave. As ruler of the winds, ruler of the winds, and of the sea near the shore, Njord was given the palace of Noatun, near the seashore, where we are told he stilled the terrible tempests stirred up by Aegir, god of the deep seas. Njord, the god of storms, whom fishers know, not born in heaven, he was in Vanaheim reared, with men, but lives a hostage with the gods. He knows each frith and every rocky creek, fringed with dark pines and sands where seafowl scream. He also extended his special protection over commerce and fishing, which two occupations could be pursued with advantage only during the short summer months, of which he was in a measure considered the personification. Njord is represented in art as a very handsome god, in the prime of life, clad in a short green tunic with a crown of shells and seaweed upon his head, or a brown-brimmed hat adorned with eagle or heron plumes. As personification of the summer, he was invoked to still the raging storms which desolated the coast during the winter months. He was also implored to to hasten the vernal warmth and thereby extinguish the winter fires. As agriculture was practiced only during the summer months, and principally along the fjords or sea inlets, Njord was also invoked for favorable harvests, for he was said to delight in prospering those who placed their trust in him. Njord's first wife, according to some authorities, was his sister, Nerthus, Mother Earth, who in Germany was identified with Frigga, as we have seen, but in Scandinavia was considered a separate divinity. Njord was, however, obliged to part with her when summoned to Asgard, where he occupied one of the 12 seats in the Great Council Hall, and was present at all the assemblies of the gods, withdrawing to Noatun only when his services were not required by the Aesir. Noatun is the 11th. There Njord has himself a dwelling made. Prince of men, guiltless of sin, he rules over the high-built fane. In his home by the seashore, Njord delighted in watching the gulls fly to and fro, and in observing the graceful movements of the swans, his favorite birds, which were held sacred to him. He spent many an hour or two gazing at the gambols of the gentle seals, which came to bask in the sunshine at his feet. Skadi, goddess of winter. Shortly after Idun's return from Thrymheim and Thiasse's death within the bounds of Asgard, the assembled gods were greatly surprised and dismayed to see Skadi, the giant's daughter, appear one day in their midst to demand satisfaction for her father's death. Although the daughter of an ugly old Hrimthurs, Skadi, the goddess of winter, was very beautiful indeed in her silvery armor, with her glittering spear, sharp-pointed arrows, short white hunting dress, white fur leggings, and broad snowshoes, and the gods could not but recognize the justice of her claim, wherefore they offered the usual fine in atonement. Skadi, however, was so angry that she at first refused their compromise and sternly demanded a life for a life until Loki, wishing to appease her wrath and thinking that if he could only make her cold lips relax in a smile, the rest would be easy, began to play all manner of pranks. Fastening a goat to himself by an invisible cord, he went through a series of antics which were reproduced by the goat, and the sight was so grotesque that all the gods fairly shouted with merriment, and even Skadi was forced to smile. Taking advantage of this softened mood, the gods pointed to the firmament where her father's eyes glowed like radiant stars in the northern hemisphere. They told her they had placed them there to show him all honor, and finally added that she might select as husband any of the gods present at the assembly, providing she were content to judge of their attractions by their naked feet. Blindfolded, so that she could see only the feet of the gods standing in a circle around her, Skadi looked about, and her gaze fell upon a pair of beautifully formed feet. She felt sure they must belong to Balder, the god of light, whose bright face had charmed her, and she designated their owner as their choice. When the bandage was removed, however, she discovered to her chagrin that she had chosen Njord, to whom her troth was plighted. But notwithstanding her disappointment, she spent a happy honeymoon in Asgard, where all seemed to delight in doing her honor. After this, Njord took his bride home to Noatun, where the monotonous sound of the waves, the shrieking of the gulls, and the cries of the seals so disturbed Skadi's slumber that she finally declared it was quite impossible for her to remain there any longer, and she implored her husband to take her back to her native Thrymheim. Sleep could I not on my sea-strand couch, for screams of the sea-fowl there wakes me, when from the wave he comes every morning the mew. Njord, anxious to please his new wife, consented to take her to Thrymheim, and to dwell there with her 9 nights out of every 12, providing she would spend the remaining 3 with him at Noatun. But when he reached the mountain region, the soughing, I'm not sure what that word is, soughing or soughing of the wind in the pines, the thunder of the avalanches, the cracking of the ice, the roar of the waterfalls, and the howling of the wolves appeared to him as unbearable as the sound of the sea had seemed to his wife, and he could not rejoice each time when his period he could not but rejoice each time when his period of exile was ended. He found himself again at Noatun. Am weary of the mountains, not long was I there, only 9 nights. The howl of the wolves methought sounded ill to the song of the swans. For some time, Njord and Skadi, who are the personifications of summer and winter, alternated thus, the wife spending the 3 short summer months by the sea, and he reluctantly remaining with her in Thrymheim during the 9 long winter months. But concluding at last that their tastes would never agree, they decided to part forever and return to their respective homes, where each could follow the occupations which custom had endeared to them. Thrymheim it's called, where Thiasse dwelt, that stream mighty giant, but Skade, or Skade, now dwells, pure bride of the gods, in her father's old mansion. Skadi now resumed her wonted pastime of hunting, leaving her realm again only to marry the semi-historical Odin, to whom she bore a son called Saving, the first king of Norway, and the supposed founder of the royal race which long ruled that country. According to other accounts, however, Skadi eventually married Ullr, the winter god. As Skadi was a skillful marksman, she is represented with bow and arrow, and as goddess of the chase, she is generally accompanied by one of the wolf-like Eskimo dogs so common in the north. Skadi was invoked by hunters and by winter travelers, whose sleighs she would guide over the snow and ice, thus helping them to reach their destination in safety. Skadi's anger against the gods, who had slain her father, the storm giant, is an emblem of the unbending rigidity of the ice-enveloped earth, which softened at last by the frolicsome play of Loki, the heat lightning, smiles, and permits the embrace of Njord, summer. His love, however, cannot hold her for more than 3 months of the year, typified in the myth by nights, as she is always secretly longing for the wintry storms and for her wonted activities among the mountains. Njord was supposed to bless the vessels passing in and out of port, and his temples were situated by the seashore, where oaths in his name were commonly sworn, and his health was drunk at every banquet, where he was invariably named with his son, Frey. As all aquatic plants were supposed to belong to him, the marine sponge was known in the north as Njord's glove, a name which was retained until lately, when the same plant has been popularly renamed the Virgin's hand. And that is where we'll stop for tonight. Next time, we'll be reading about the god Frey, who I have heard of before. But again, I know really very little about him. I think after him we'll probably get the Freya, since there was I think brother and sister, I believe. Yep, Freya. So we'll get to that. But again, thank you all for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider liking the video, leaving a comment below, and of course subscribe if you haven't. I was looking at YouTube statistics, and I know that there is a fair chunk of viewers actually who are not subscribed. So if you're not, please consider hitting the subscribe button and the bell as well, so that you don't miss any future videos. But for tonight, I hope you all have a very good sleep and pleasant dreams.